Namaste and welcome to yet another engaging conversation. And as promised, when we first spoke to the person who claimed to have decrypted or decoded the Indus script, many were in disbelief. But then, as we unraveled how he went about it, it became quite an engaging conversation, but it's also quite intense. So, this is part two of the Indus script decoded conversation with Yajnadevam, who's with us. So, good to have you with us in person.
Nice to be here. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the
So,
opportunity.
so how's the response been? Let's start by you've traveled to Bharat after the entire decoding happened, and there was quite a buzz about it. So wherever you've gone and you've given talks across multiple institutions and platforms, what is the reaction?
Yes, so I have been to IISc and there's a small cryptography group, and I wanted the cryptographers to look at it. Uh, Everywhere so far it's been positive. There's been difficult questions in the sense it was good to have experts who have come prepared, thought about the whole process, and try to find places where things can be refined. And it was, yes, it's very illuminating. IISc, then IIT Chennai, IIT Hyderabad, and now we are here for a more general audience.
So anywhere where somebody did not agree or disbelieved your findings or tried to discredit your findings?
It is hard to discredit something that has a mathematical proof. They would have to discredit it mathematically.
Hmm.
But people did have, because it's such a shocking revelation, that people were struggling to sync up both the worldviews. And I got some very difficult questions from an expert in information theory, and I was able to answer. And in the end, he was convinced. This was in IIT Hyderabad,
Hmm.
and I take it as a win for my side, because all of these guys are the top experts in India in terms of cryptography, information theory, Sanskrit, the general linguistics, and so on, which is a more thorough and a more strict examination or review than you would get in a journal, because in a journal you have two people. Here I have dozens of experts.
Hmm. So, are you going to publish these conversations? Because somewhere, Yadna Devam, there are many who believe you have not been peer reviewed, you have not been published in Nature and Science or some of these platforms where, even in the past, those who have been researching on the Indus script and who've done some bits have been published, have been spoken about. What's your point of view there?
Right. So as I said, when you submit to a journal, it is typically reviewed by two people, and if they both agree, it gets published. If they both disagree, it gets discarded. If it's one and one, they get a third reviewer. But my paper has been reviewed by dozens of experts. So as far as peer review is concerned, my paper has more peer review than a journal paper. As for publishing it in a journal, currently the paper is technically still in the draft stage.
Hmm.
I'm making some incremental improvements, and I hope to publish the whole paper in the coming year.
Hmm. So, taking our conversation from where we let off, the last time around, you'd said that one, the core language is Sanskrit. Two, that there has been an evolution over 500 to 1,000 years. And these kind of evolutions don't happen overnight in a decade or 4 or 5 decades. Languages don't change like that, scripts don't change like that. So, this entire Aryan invasion theory also somewhere gets junked. But then you said you're further in the process of mining more of the Indus scripts and the manuscripts. Uh, what is your learning going forward from the last when we spoke?
So I've been mostly traveling. I haven't read more inscriptions, but I do believe that the Indus script, the inscriptions, talk about the. It describes the various artifacts of the Indus Valley. It describes the worship of Shiva, the Puranic, motifs that are in the inscriptions, and I see a general continuation of Indian history.
Hmm.
So I don't see anything that is extra Indian, in the sense what is. I don't see any discontinuity.
So you don't see any discontinuity.
I do not see any discontinuity. Discontinuity would be very obvious, and if you may have remember from some of our conversation, the Indus sites continue till about 800 700 BC in Haryana. And Haryana is where the Rigvedic, all the stories take place. If there was an entry of an outside population, you would see it in the material culture. Even small things like a change in pottery, uh, destruction of some sites, or any, there would be obvious signs. There were hundreds of sites in Haryana, and many continue to exist till 800 BCE. So we see none of that. So it would be it would be an extraordinary claim to say that people appeared from nowhere, left no signs, and changed everything. It's going to be like every single thing, you know, has to be overturned to believe in this hypothesis that somehow in a short time everything was overturned.
Now, over a period of say 2 to 3,000 years, the entire Indus Valley civilization, because some of the scripts go back to, if I remember correctly, 2,500 BC, if not older, and you said as late as 700 BC. So there is clearly about 2,000 to 2,500 years. Now, based on what you understood, was Sanskrit always the core language? How did a language so scientific and so thorough get evolved? For that, that civilization had to be highly evolved.
Right. So we have a small amount of scripts from 3,300 BC. From 3,000 BC, we start getting more, but the bulk of it is from 2,600 BCE. The number of inscriptions drops after 1,900, but we continue to get Indus inscriptions in small amounts, even into Kaushambi, which is like 100 BC, 100 CE. So it's a very long time. And to this point, the inscription in India have always been Sanskrit.
Okay.
I have not found any. I may find, because there's still stuff to read. So far, we have evidence of only one language. And it may be that just like it's those are like mottos or slogans, just like today we use Satyameva Jayate, even though there are other languages. The most important slogans are the things that represent culture and state. You continue to use the classical language of that region. So yes, I do believe that Sanskrit was an important unifying language for that whole culture.
No, I'm also thinking, because it's a general audience, so I'm not going to get into the technicality of it, because we've talked about the formula, how you crack the code. I'm trying to get into what did you learn.
Yes.
So that's the perspective from where I'm arriving. Did you realize that they were a highly advanced civilization? Did they have principles of economics? Did they have principles of warfare? Did they have principles of society?
Yes, yes. And we know most of this even before the inscription. We know, for example, that the Indus Valley people sent mercenaries to Sumeria in order to help a rebellion. We know they have standardized weights across the whole geography. So it is one thing to say that standardized weights in this city. It's another thing to say the same standard exists across 1,000 sites. So just imagine the effort and time and organization to develop and propagate it and convince people, hey, use this standard. So by the time the mature Harappan started in 2600 BC, the standard had already been established. So it was highly organized society in terms of art. If you look at the bangles and this, I mean, whatever artifacts we can find, the patterns on pottery, even the uniformity of the inscriptions, the themes, they are all uniform across time and space. When I say space, obviously I mean from the westernmost to the easternmost sites, but even time. The earliest inscriptions have the same theme as from 1,000 years later. So they're culturally, they are very united. There are inscriptions regarding they're mostly religious in nature. There are some inscriptions that describe the incidents from Puranas and so on. So it is definitely, so one of the things that I find it hard to explain is that it's a good thing that it confirms the continuity of the civilization. it is a bad thing that we don't learn anything new because it's a continuous civilization. So, for example, they did not write the names of kings. They did write names of Vedic poets like Vamra and so on, and some of these Kanva and so on. So we see names we already know. There is no real legal code. There is no, you know, but yeah, it's, and the style, the purpose of the inscriptions, they continue into the Gupta era. So we can kind of get an idea that the Indus Valley essentially continued its culture into the Gupta era, and the Indus Valley culture was similar to the Gupta era. The script changed slightly from Indus script to Brahmi script, but other than that, it's a continuous civilization.
So, how would you explain the change of the script but continuity of the language? And the other aspect is, for all that entire narrative that was spread, that we have come to teach you because you are unread, you are not civilized, we've come to civilize you, and we are the ones who are going to give you knowledge. Does all of that get
It would get falsified for sure. It would get invalidated. So first of all, I've shown that in many Bronze Age scripts, or many scripts, the history of scripts, if you look at it, they start in different ways, mostly pictorial, and eventually they standardize.
correct?
And at some point, the Indus script was standardized, and the standardized script is essentially the Brahmi script because the symbols are the same, with very minor variations, some rotations here and there. So the script did not come from outside. This is essentially, I can even show a mathematical quantification that the closest script, like 90-95% to the Brahmi script, from which all other present scripts derived today, came from the Indus script. So nobody came to teach you writing. You were writing, and there's a continuous history of Brahmi up to 200, 300 CE. And so did people come in from outside to teach you? I don't know who came, who taught what. There is no one can enumerate those. So the original idea of something called the second urbanization was that Indus Valley was unknown when they created the story of migration and civilization of the Indian continent, subcontinent. And then they found the Indus Valley. Now they had to adapt to it. And their adaptation was that, well, Indus Valley had already died out. You know, the people had lost all the technology of civilization, of urbanization, trade, commerce, standardization, administration. Everything was lost. You people had become hunter-gatherers, or, you know, essentially primitive people.
Yeah, gone back to being savages or primitive.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people from outside came in, taught you all the good things, and made you, you know, civilized again. So this is essentially the narrative. And unfortunately for the narrative, that happened to assume that the Indus civilization stopped at 1900 BCE. They could put an ingress at 1500. They could put Vedas at 1200, and so on. But the Indus sites continue to exist till 700 BC. So if anybody, and in the exact space where the Vedic age is, Vedic stories are, and you would see that. So now you would have to place this second urbanization, the people who came in, their ingress would have to be after 700 BC, and that is just logistically impossible.
Impossible.
And we also spoke about the vastness of Indian, the ancient Indian literature, like how many things there are. You cannot fit it into such a small space. You need a couple of thousand more years. You actually do need even before the mature phase. You need from 3000 BCE.
Correct.
Because for the stories to develop, for the symbolism, for the language change itself, the change in vocabulary, the development of linguistic changes, and so on. So I have never understood that narrative of some invasion and, you know, like everyone coming in. And so I'll give you an example. I want you, let's say you get an unlimited budget. I want you to go to all the mechanics and tell them to change the word screwdriver into Anand Narasimhan. Okay? You can pay them, you can bribe them, you can threaten them, you can beat them. Actually, don't beat them. But I'm saying, if you have an unlimited budget,
Yeah.
can you go in one city, in Delhi or Noida, can you change that one word? Even they should never write it, all the written things you have to change.
Yeah, it's got to be replaced with Anand. Yeah. So screwdriver will henceforth be called Anand.
Anand.
Yeah.
Can you do that for one word in one city? No. Even today with social media, it's going to be impossible.
Yeah.
Now imagine claiming that they changed roughly about 100, 200,000 words in 10,000 villages, and they did it like instantly with before social media, before highways. Like, how did they go to all the villages?
Yeah.
So it is it's an extraordinary claim. It's an event. Such an event has never happened. Like, language has been replaced, but it has never been erased without trace.
Erase without trace. Correct. So otherwise you will have to do a control alt reboot of the entire brain, all the people's their brains, recode them, do them, and this was supposed to be people
And-
came from grasslands.
And what is the need? So why would you come from the steppes or wherever and say, "Oh, these guys have this technology called brick," whatever the word they thought it was used, and say, "Well, I'm going to change it to Ishtika, okay?
Ishtika.
And I'm going to go everywhere and tell everybody, hey, whatever word you're using, I want you to use this new word from today." Why would you even need to do that for one thing, let alone 100,000 things?
Correct.
Like navigation, the whole administration thing, the scales to weigh, the word for commerce, the word for fishing, the word for grains, literally 100,000 words. Why would you even think of that instead of just saying, I'm going to use this word?
Yeah.
So that is a nonsensical claim. And if you think about it, the word for Ishtika means the one that carries the sacrifice. Ishti and
Yeah.
Ika, right? So the bricks were first invented to do the yajnas. You would do the yajnas on the bricks like that, falcon altar. And then later they were purposed for construction. So that is why their name is Ishtika. So is it possible that people who never had bricks would come in and see the bricks that these people had and figure out that, well, these are ruins, they have houses, but they must have used it for a sacrifice, so I'm going to back pedal and figure out a good name in my language. I mean, everything that you can think of becomes absurd. So the people who are familiar with Indian texts, they never took it seriously because it just wouldn't fit in the timeline. And the issue is that mostly Indians were, they were given a summary meaning that never looked into depth because it's a paragraph you learn in your thing and you write the exam and you're done. But after doing this decipherment, I was also not thinking about this invasion migration stuff. After doing this migration, people came to me and said, yeah, this mathematical proof is correct. I understand this. I understand information cannot be created out of nothing. Even God cannot do it.
Correct.
This is one of the few things God cannot do. Then, but still, what about this invasion theory? And I was like, it's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis based on the axiomatic model, which itself is a model of language relationships. So let me tell you what that means. So when they learned that Greek, Latin, Sanskrit were similar, they said these are similar, but what is the similarity based on? Then they just decided it is similar like a tree structure. So when you create an axiomatic model, what that means is I am creating an assumption.
Correct.
And I'm going to try to reconstruct it. So an axiomatic model is never, it is useful, like geometry is axiomatic, pentagons are, you don't find them in nature, but geometry is useful. But it doesn't mean it's true. You cannot confuse that or conflate that with an empirical model. An empirical model comes from actual evidence.
The evidence.
So so they assumed it's a tree, and then it is useful. It is it's useful for certain things, but they then eventually some people assumed that it's empirical. It's an actual language spoken in an actual place, because it's a tree. It has an origin. Now there are other models like the wave model, which don't require an origin. And when you think about even the different steppe cultures, their genetics moves, but the people have different cultures. They have different clothes. They have different pottery. and that's because genetics can move without language moving.
Yeah.
And that's why you can have the genetics come here without language, without archaeological evidence, nothing.
Correct.
So there is, so my explanation is that just like willow trees can move their genetics without the trees moving, people
Yeah.
can move their genetics without actually moving. The people don't have to move. So I would, if I can recommend, I would just say drop this invasion theory entirely. It's impossible to make it meaningful.
True. Now let's talk about some of the other core languages, Indian and international. One of the conversations is, what is this entire Dravidian logic? Now, the word Dravida means something else altogether, like Shankaracharya described, so I'm aware of that. But there is always this differentiation between Sanskrit and Tamil. And this fact that Tamil was a different language, it's an original language, and Sen Tamil, or however you may call it, is considered to be the oldest language. So, where is the correlation between Indus Valley, Sanskrit, the Indus script, and also Tamil? So, did the origin, exist simultaneously?
So there is many hypotheses regarding Dravidian languages. There is a proposal that it came from Iran. And I was kind of amazed that all languages came from outside. Like, something came from the steppes, like the northern Indian languages came from steppes, southern Indian languages came from Iran, Munda came from Southeast Asia. So the people here were not speaking anything. I don't think it makes sense. I think there is an alternate hypothesis that there's something called the Southern Neolithic, approximately around North Karnataka today, but it could be, it could be a larger region. And so the population in South India was smaller. And whenever there is, so the way the language evolves is that when you're a hunter-gatherer, your language completely changes in about 4,500 years.
Okay.
So in Australia, Papua New Guinea, people have been there for 80,000 or 60,000, depending on the different papers. But their languages are only 4,500 years old because it changes very fast.
Okay.
So the language starts to stabilize when people settle and farm. So in India, people have been there for at least 50,000 years. So they must have had a lot of languages. And there were two Neolithic movements, one near the Gangetic Plain, the other in South India. So two languages stabilized. And after the IVC started having climate change, people started moving out. They started moving west, east, south, and north also. The people who migrated south, they retained or they adopted the southern Neolithic language, and that became what today is we consider Dravidian, different Dravidian, and the different Dravidians have different amount of Sanskrit borrowings.
Yeah, correct.
And it is, if you look at the size of the population, most of the genetics is really from Indus Valley, even in the south. There may be 2-3%, small percentage of difference. But what that means is the people who migrated from Indus Valley chose to adopt and retain and enrich what is today considered Dravidian. And you have to admire them because now you live in a nation which has too rich linguistic heritage. And as, from someone from a South Indian heritage, I'm guessing you and me both, we are lucky to enjoy both of these.
Both of this, correct.
Right? So and in about that, they say she was Damaru, one side Tamil, one side Sanskrit, and I think that's a beautiful way to explain how both languages flowered in this subcontinent.
But what about the international languages? Because there are a lot of European languages today who draw similarities with Sanskrit and also to a certain extent Persian. So where is the connect? And even Russian. So if you look at Russian, there are a lot of words which have got very, very clearly Sanskrit roots or Indian names too, similarities. So did languages move from here, there? People move northward, westward, eastward?
Right. So that is the question. Is the relationship of languages a tree? In which case you would assume that people moved and took the languages, or is it more likely that languages diffuse based on the usefulness of certain words and concepts? And and this is not new in linguistics. There's something called the wave model. There's something called areal feature. An areal feature essentially means that there's an idea or a concept in a language that develops in a certain area, in a certain spot, and it spreads in an area.
Okay.
Now you have to understand that once you, the reason for this areal feature is that the tree model just breaks down in certain situations. It doesn't explain certain things.
Okay.
So, for example, the satamization, which you see in the Slavic languages and the Indian languages, you don't see it in Greek, for example.
So
But
when you say satamization, what does that?
satamization is like in India, like in Indian languages, to say 100 you say shata. But in Western European languages, you say, kentam, like Kent, right? So that the k becomes sha.
Okay.
So that you couldn't really put that in a tree model. So you have to say, it happened because of an area.
Sir becomes her. Sing becomes her.
That's a
hints
different
or
change.
something.
Yeah, that's a different change. So there are changes like that that can only be described as aerial features. People, people just pick up in an area. But if things can be explained as just going through an area, then you don't need a tree, because everything can be explained as the tree model becomes redundant. And if there's no tree model, then migration becomes redundant. You don't need any migration to occur for languages to flow.
Correct.
When you think about it, even today, you use the word like, I'm talking about not as we're speaking in English, but you'll see people who are non-English speakers use words like mobile, email, and so on.
Yeah.
So because it's a useful concept, it moved with technology, and there are other things like government and some other words will flow because it's useful. So it's just even like plurals and some of these concepts will flow. So you may not even need the tree model. So you may not need to have a tree or a migration to explain how languages move. It's just useful, it moves.
So the other thing is we were discussing something offline and you talked about rivers, how rivers were named and how the similarity flowed. So have you been able to deep dive a little more on that and bring it, and I want to dovetail that back into the script aspect, that are there, how would I say, residue of the Brahmi in some of the international scripts or global scripts?
Right, okay. So the rivers, that's a good question, because the river names tend to recur in many places. And so, for example, there's a river called Ab. Ab is essentially a Persianized, or even I think some Indian texts have. It's from Up, which means water. In Vedic text, Up is water, and Ab becomes is name of water, in name of many rivers in Eastern Eurasia. And Apam, which is also water, becomes Avam, or it's spelled Avon. It's actually Aban, and that in the Britannic Islands. So the river names also flow, and the idea is that the river names reflect the first names of the people who speak the first language, the language of the first settlers. Because it's very hard to rename rivers, especially large rivers. A city you can rename. You take control of the city. You say from tomorrow this is, Narasimhapur or whatever, or any word, any name you want, and that name changes. But rivers, you have to change everyone. You have to go everywhere.
Who's along the river,
Right.
every civilization.
Because they wouldn't understand that you have renamed it. So they have more, it has more network effect. So the question is, how did these names get there? And that is a potential, because the northern Eurasian names are all Indo-Iranian, which is stage of the language before being split into Iranic and Indian, and like the Sanskrit. The idea is that the people who migrated and traveled there and settled there were speaking that language. So that also is a problem, because if for the narrative, the invasion narrative, because you don't find the alleged Proto-Indo-European names anywhere, you don't find Proto, any of those reconstructed languages, you don't find the names for them.
Yeah.
You only find the names of actual attested civilizations and actual attested languages. So in Turkey, you find Anatolian names, Greek names, Turkish names,
Correct.
because that is the history of people settling there, and So in North India, you would have to find, at least for the long rivers, you would have to have the old names before, if they're claiming that Sanskrit came from outside. Long rivers like Ganga, Sindhu, and all of these should be many rivers. Almost every river should have a non-Sanskrit name, which we don't see.
Which does not exist. The other thing, quickly, I wanted to understand. We have limited time, also. That the Saraswati bed.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
it dried up. So you've made a case that over a few centuries, the Saraswati
Yes.
dried up, and the civilization kept shrinking because it had to keep moving
Yeah.
as the water shrank. But did that phenomenon happen only on the eastern side, or was it also a phenomenon on the western side of the Saraswati? And did both sides speak the same language?
Right. I understand what you're saying, because Saraswati was a broad river, it's
Yeah.
22 kilometers. But we do know people were using boats. In fact, they were using boats to travel oceans, so definitely they are crossing the banks. And we know that the sites, the inscriptions on both sides of the sites are relatively uniform. So they were crossing over, they're speaking the same language, they had the same culture. In fact, all of Indus Valley had the same language and culture.
Same language and culture.
Right. I mean, they did have different dialects. We know because of the way the script is, where the inscriptions are. But that is expected. That's not controversial. So when you say it dried and did it affect both east and west, so what really happened is when the river dried, it would go underground, and some places it would come back up. So the dry spots, people would move north, and as it dried down the south, they would move south. So the people who are called Saraswats, some of them ended up in Kashmir because they started going north. Others ended up in Dwarka and then eventually to Goa because they went south. So that, it affected, it mostly split them north and south, not east and west.
No, but those who were on the other side of the Saraswati, so did they towards Iran, towards Afghanistan, did they move
Of
that
course.
way?
So, and I don't think it's just the Saraswati. I think overall the climate was so bad. 100 years of drought. Is not a laughing matter. I don't care how sophisticated you are. Your wells will go dry, and especially in that Gujarat, Rajasthan area, after a certain depth, there is salt. So your wells are only useful up to a certain point. If you dig deeper, you can't use that water.
Yeah.
So they had to migrate, and the people migrated in all directions. So some people went south, some people went east, some people went west. Most definitely people went west because that they had trade routes to the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
They were trading with Sumeria and so on. So they took a boat or they went on the land route, and they most definitely migrated west.
People may challenge, people may accept, but what do you think will lend credibility to what you've done? Because what you've done is people have been attempting it for hundreds of years.
Yes.
So for it to be solved like that, one is unbelievable. Two, is it credible for more people to lend in weight? And three, once you are able to establish that, what do you think will be done with it, with this knowledge?
Okay, so the issue with deciphering a script is that people tend to accept it very slowly. It's nothing to do with only Indus script. When Champollion deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphs, it was not accepted until after he died. When Linear B was deciphered by Michael Ventris, it took many, many years before it was accepted. So there is definitely, like for the zodiac cipher and so on, because there was unicity distance, it got faster acceptance. And Indus script, I think they would have accepted immediately because I have the same mathematical proof, except for all this baggage of, the contradicting narratives. And I think that the paper has been written in such a way that people can follow. Just educated people, you don't have to be an expert, you can follow and you can understand and you can accept. Even the proof or the math is not that involved. It takes a little bit of effort, but it's not very complicated. It's high school mathematics. So I do think that eventually people will come to accept it, and it will be accelerated if academics like cryptographers, mathematicians, and linguists endorse it. I can publish it in a journal. I don't think it will cause a big difference, because we have seen whenever anything contradicts their favorite theory, like Haggarty's paper,
Yeah.
a lot of the Karganists don't accept it.
No, they don't. So correct.
So the publishing itself doesn't do much. It's really when something is falsifiable, and they attempt it and they cannot falsify it, that's essentially it. So it takes time, it takes education, and what we can do next, I believe, I've been surprised by the interest in this, and how much the civilizational
Yeah.
response to it, the energized, and I think what we really should do is to create like a living replica of like an Indus city with like Indus sign, and kind of educate people about the history of your culture, the continuity of your culture, and just disseminate this knowledge. And if private interests or government interests want to figure out how to contribute to that, then I can do the ideological part.
Fantastic. So when's your paper coming out?
Like I said, I'm making incremental improvements. In sometime in 2025, I'll try to publish it. As I said, the preprint is out, but most journals will not be warm to it, because it is very hard in academia, anything that's to do with humanities, to print something that ruins many people's life's work. And I don't blame them. It's that way. But hopefully things will change. Hopefully there's a journal that's brave enough to take on the controversy, because just because you publish something, it doesn't mean it's you are invalidating everything. You're just saying that this is an authentic paper and this needs to be discussed.
Yeah.
That's all it means. So I hope some journal is brave enough to do that, and let's see where it goes.
I know there are many institutions in Bharat who are in touch with you, and they want
Yes.
to formulate the paper and publish it and take this work forward for the benefit of the country. Let's hope that happens sooner than later. Yajnadevam, pleasure to meet you and to see you here in person.
Thank you.
Congratulations, great job done.
Thank you,
so
sir.
much. Thank you.